Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a major policy debate in Sri Lanka that has the nation's journalists, well, on high alert. It's a story about reform, repression, and a real battle over who gets to shape the future of the country's media.
So let's get right into it. The Sri Lankan government is championing a new national media policy, and they're presenting it as a key part of their big state reform agenda. But the country's largest professional journalists association is sounding the alarm, calling it a dangerous move to suppress the press.
To really understand what's going on, we first need to look at the two very different stories being told about this exact same policy.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. You've got this stark contrast. On one side, the government is framing this as a necessary reform, to protect citizens and bring the media landscape into the modern age. But on the other side, the Sri Lanka Working Journalists Association, or SLWJA, they see a direct threat, a tool designed not for protection, but for control.
So where did this policy actually come from? Well, according to the Journalists Union, the answer is what really gets to the heart of the problem. They argue this policy isn't some new idea at all, but actually an unwanted inheritance from a much more, let's say, controversial administration.
And that brings us to the policy's origins. The SLWJ alleges that this whole thing has a hidden and, from their point of view, a very troubling history. They claim it's being sold as a fresh start, but its roots lie in a much more controversial past. So, if you look at this timeline from the SLWJ's perspective, it's pretty damning. They point out that the policy was born under an administration they saw as actively hostile to media freedom, the same one that pushed through that really unpopular Online Safety Act. So their argument is that the new government has simply picked up where the old one left off.
And this quote, wow, it just brilliantly illustrates their whole argument with this powerful metaphor. The president of the SLWJA is basically saying that the new government, which, remember, came to power promising change, is now trying to legitimize a policy created by its predecessor, an administration they once opposed for its anti-media stance.
The whole controversy gets even deeper when you look at how this policy was supposedly developed. The government claims it was a collaborative process, but the Journalists Union, they argue it was a deception right from the very beginning.
To prove there was consultation, the government points to this number, 23. That's how many members were on a committee formed to discuss the policy. And on the surface, that sounds collaborative, but the SLWJ argues the problem isn't the number, it's about who was actually in the room.
A major red flag for the union is that 10 of those 23 members were ex officio, which basically means they were government officials automatically put on the committee. We're talking about officials from the president's media unit and the heads of state media. So the SLWJA is asking, how can a committee possibly be independent when nearly half its members are the very government it's supposed to be holding accountable?
And this is a really crucial point. The SLWJA says their opposition isn't new. They claim they walked out of the very first meeting, which was held under the previous government because a draft had already been written without their input. And get this, they accuse the media ministry of still listing them as a supporting organization, a claim the union president calls a blatant lie used to create a false sense of consensus.
And look, they're not alone in this. According to the SLWJ, a big coalition of key media organizations has formally withdrawn from the whole process. They sent a joint letter saying the entire initiative just lacks transparency and legitimacy.
All right, the union also points to what they see as a huge contradiction between what the new government promised when it was in the opposition and what it's doing now that it's in power. So they lay out these repeated documented attempts to just talk, to have a dialogue about the serious issues facing journalists. They sent letters, they made requests to 2 different ministers and even the president himself, only to be met with complete silence. This, they argue, shows a deliberate refusal to even listen to their concerns.
And this really captures a moment of intense frustration for the union. At a meeting on June 14th, the media minister publicly agreed with them. He told his officials to discard the controversial draft and start a fresh discussion. But just days later, the ministry sent out an invitation to further discuss the very same draft he had just promised to scrap. The union blames a bureaucratic mafia for undermining the minister, but they say the minister himself is responsible for letting it happen.
So why does a fight over one policy matter so much, right? Well, according to the SLWJA, this isn't just some internal media debate. They connect it to the fundamental health of Sri Lankan democracy and the real, everyday struggles of working journalists.
What the union is saying is that this whole policy is just a distraction from the real crises facing the media. They say the government should be focused on reforming state media so it stops acting as a government mouthpiece and on addressing the terrible labor conditions where so many journalists are dealing with extremely low pay and job insecurity. Instead, they see a policy that does nothing to solve these core problems.
So it all boils down to the union's core belief that this policy, which was inherited from a repressive government and is being pushed forward without any genuine consultation, is not about reform at all. They are convinced its true purpose is to give the state more power to control the narrative and suppress critical voices.
And that's really what this all comes down to, leaving us with this one big question. In any country, whenever a government moves to regulate the media, the central question is always about who stands to benefit. Is the real goal to empower the public with reliable information, to protect the press's ability to hold power accountable, or is it to shield politicians from scrutiny? That's the question right at the heart of this entire debate.